Islam is like a parasite, which is a very harsh word to use, I know. But religion, I think, is also a parasite in the way in which it just digs its way inside you, and until you're convinced that it's part of your identity. Whatever religion you happen to practice, well, this is you, which makes sense because you're taught that this is the foundation of your life. And so when you're talking to a Muslim, even if you're just criticizing the ideas, they feel like they're being personally attacked. Hello everyone. I'm back. I'm Secular Spirit. Welcome to this very special discussion on Islamophobia and how it might make it very difficult to offer very legitimate criticisms of Islam. And I'm joined by Emma Thorne. Welcome, Emma. And you can see the first part of our discussion on Emma's channel. And yeah, so let's do part 2, shall we? So in the first part, we talked a little bit about our own experiences with Islam and our perceptions of it, and the issue of Islamophobia, which I think we both agreed is very real in our respective countries, the UK for you, Canada for me. And then we ended by talking a little bit about our concerns about Islam. So naturally, I think the next thing we should talk about is a really important question, a really difficult question, I would say, a very challenging one. How do we critique Islam without feeding Islamophobia or just, good old-fashioned anti-Muslim bigotry and racism? Not a very easy question to answer. But just to recap, I think I also want to mention that definition of Islamophobia that I mentioned in part 1, if that makes sense to do. So again, Islamophobia can be described as stereotypes, bias, or acts of hostility towards individual Muslims or followers of Islam in general. In addition to individual acts of intolerance and racial profiling, Islamophobia leads to viewing Muslims as a greater security threat on an institutional, systemic, and societal level. Wow. Okay. Second time saying that. All right. Okay. So here's my first concern with even this definition of Islamophobia, which I think is the best one I've read. The issue is it leaves a lot open to interpretation on what is considered, let's say, stereotypes, bias, acts of hostility, even intolerance. All of these things are really open to interpretation, and they could be very subjective. So I'll give you a very straightforward example. So one of the main criticisms that Islam gets from people outside of Islam is that the Prophet Muhammad, the main figure in Islam, the one who's supposed to be a role model for Muslims and whose words and actions we're supposed to respect and follow as much as we possibly can. So it's just a fact within the Islamic tradition that he married a child. So he married someone when she was a girl when she was 6 years old, and consummated the marriage when she reached puberty at the age of 9. So this is what a lot of Muslims believe. This is what a lot of the Islamic tradition teaches. So let's say, Emma, you're known to be critical of religion in certain ways. Would you say that's fair to say?
Certainly, yes.
Okay. So you're known to be critical of religion. You I would say did not come from a Muslim background, and you're from the UK. You're white. So because of all of these things, if you say this factual statement, it can be perceived of Muhammad having married a child. It can be perceived as Islamophobic.
Mm-hmm.
And if a Muslim were to say it, and there are Muslim scholars who talk about it and who do assert that this is indeed factual and it does come from Islamic tradition. So you have the Quran, which is the most important thing, and then you have the Hadith, which are the words of the Prophet Muhammad that have been recorded. So those are the two most important sources of Islamic law and Islamic tradition. So there are hadiths that explicitly say that Muhammad married a child. So this is known within the Islamic community, but when the Muslim says it, especially if it's a Muslim scholar, it's not a big deal. So what this means is that even something that is a very straightforward fact can be perceived to be Islamophobic if you said it, and totally okay if someone else says it. And that's because of not even your intentions, but your suspected intentions. There'll be criticisms that, oh, well, Emma, you can't even talk about Islam because you weren't raised into it. You can't even speak Arabic, so how can you even say anything? So you can't even have an opinion because of these limitations of yours. And to just kind of talk about me a little bit, it can be said that, well, I don't understand and I'm not an expert in the full classical Arabic of the Quran era, so how can I possibly criticize what's in the Quran? Or I'll be accused of being someone who has been corrupted by the West and seduced by its materialism and just the desire to have wild premarital sex as much as I want. So what it comes down to is the facts don't really matter when it's subjective and open to interpretation, which does fall in that Islamophobia definition. So your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, based on that definition, I was thinking, as you say, I am indeed critical of religion. If there was an equivalent definition of certain, if there was Christian phobia in the same way, I think I would absolutely be guilty of it. And I have had pushback from Christians of a similar nature, but there's no situation in which the content I've made criticizing Christianity would be, taken down from a website or banned somewhere or something like that. Whereas we've seen that happen to people speaking about Islam. There's plenty of examples of, things like the example you gave where I was trying to look up something else and I found this by accident. There was a YouTuber, an ex-Muslim YouTuber, banned. Their YouTube page or something was banned in Pakistan just because of the same thing of somebody being critical of Islam in a way that was just highlighting what the doctrine is, what the faith states, even if it's factual. I just think that's such a dangerous precedent to set for anything. I just think that we should be able to critique any belief, any faith system. I mean, like you said, the question is so hard. I don't know what the good way to do it. I don't even know if should it be Islamophobia, should the bad parts be covered in by terms like bigotry and racism. The reports, the kind of equivalent UK investigative reports, when they've talked about it, they've basically said that the current laws, again, just in the UK this is, but the current laws on, bigotry and protecting against hate crimes and things basically don't cover a lot of Islamophobia. So there's kind of a need for something else. Not to be a slippery slope fallacy kind of person, but we run the risk of not being able to critique it at all. I shared an article with you before over there was somebody was doing GCSEs. I think it was GCSEs. They were doing exams, and they were saying that animal slaughter is that they find it disgusting, something like that. It was an opinion about that. And
about the halal method.
The halal, they didn't like. I think specifically they said the animal slaughter or something. They were opining that it was bad and distasteful. They didn't like the treatment of animals, and they were disqualified temporarily by their teacher from the exam. It was overturned in the end, which is a relief. But the idea that someone, especially somebody who is not a Muslim, could see that opinion and have such a knee-jerk reaction that this is phobic, this is bigoted, to have this opinion on some old doctrine that is probably problematic and we should all maybe agree is problematic. I just think that's a dangerous place to start from. Do you know what I mean?
Definitely. That's where the risk is, really, that any kind of criticism could be just conflated with anti-Muslim bigotry, Islamophobia. That's why there's been this movement even to just, within the ex-Muslim community, to just not even use the term Islamophobia, because it is really used extensively in this blanket way where any kind of criticism coming from any party can just be called that, and has been called that.
Mm-hmm.
And so here's an important thing to maybe mention as well. One of the main motivations for me doing this stuff, of talking about Islam and my issues with it, is because I realized, let's say it was someone like you, Emma, or to mention a few more famous examples, famous for now, who knows in the future. So let's say Christopher Hitchens or Sam Harris, or of course Richard Dawkins. So they'll be accused of not being part of the Muslim tradition or culture, and they don't really understand the religion, and they'll be dismissed as Islamophobic and doing it for their own Western agenda, whatever that happens to be. So I felt like, what if we had more people like me? So coming from a Muslim background, people who actually lived and experienced Islam, who know it inside out, and who I think it'd be very hard to accuse someone like me of being racist as well, when
Mm-hmm.
I'm part of this race, if you want to call it that. So isn't that a sad state of affairs, though? That the only criticisms that can come about something or a belief system have to be from people within it. And even then, me and people like me don't get off scot-free. As I mentioned earlier, we've been corrupted by the West, or we just don't really understand the religion. And I get accusations of, I was never really Muslim. I didn't really believe. And it's really sad to see. And I also get accused of enabling Islamophobes, which was the concern you mentioned earlier. So even doing something like this, I would be accused of, well, you're just enabling horrible atrocities against Muslims. And that is the problem. So I do have a suggestion of ways we can kind of parse and separate Islamophobia and legitimate criticism. So I will also mention, I don't care about the term Islamophobia per se. So people want to use that, sure. I understand that its meaning is being really broadened and distorted, but let's just go and use that. So here's my suggestion. I think it has to come down to the intent and target of the person who's saying something that's criticism of Islam. So intent is important, although it is hard to know. So here's a way of putting it. When you're talking about something, are you intending that Muslims be harmed, be killed? Then you're probably Islamophobic. If your aim is to just address the problematic issues they lead in their lives while still respecting their right to practice that, as long as they're not harming anyone else, that's a bit different. And beyond target as well, and here's something I always say on my channel, is I'm not targeting the Muslims. If anything, I want to help the Muslims come to the same understanding that I did, to step outside the perspective of their own belief and look at their religion with an open mind, which is really difficult to do when you're born and raised into it, or just indoctrinated into it at a later age. So in that sense, I see a lot of Muslims as victims of Islam. I don't like using that word, victim, too much.
Mm-hmm.
But in many ways they are, and they just don't realize it. And I genuinely think that their lives would be better without it. So in that sense, my target isn't the Muslims. It is the Islamic ideas they believe. And this is where we come to one of the risks of doing this as well, is Islam is like a parasite, which is a very harsh word to use, I know. But religion, I think, is also a parasite in the way in which it just digs its way inside you, and until you're convinced that it's part of your identity. Whatever religion you happen to practice, well, this is you, which makes sense because you're taught that this is the foundation of your life. And so when you're talking to a Muslim, even if you're just criticizing the ideas, they feel like they're being personally attacked. So despite that, I think if we do focus on the ideas, the teachings, and not on the Muslim person themselves, then I think you can say that this is a legitimate criticism.
I agree. And I think that's applicable to any religion that is something that, say, we don't know so much about in the West, or something that causes, kind of phobic or bigoted reactions like Judaism. There's a lot of anti-Semitism recently, and I think you can apply the same kind of rules.
Oh, definitely.
I found an op-ed in an online journal called Free Inquiry, and they kind of rounded off with a couple of questions to sort of identify whether something is Islamophobic or a genuine criticism of Islam. And these are the main ones I liked. One was, how much does the person engage in broad generalizations, saying all Muslims are X, Y? And again, I think that's very applicable to any religion. And I think it's an easy way to tell if someone doesn't know what they're talking about, because there are always so many subtle differences in the way people practice and interpret every religion that you can't make those kind of sweeping generalizations. And the other one is also about intent. What's the apparent intention behind the criticism? Is it offered in a reasoned way, or does the criticism represent the opinion of a theocrat from a different religion? Which is the kind of person that I'm concerned about from my comment section, that is a Christian wanting an atheist to, attack a Muslim instead of a Christian.
The classic whataboutism. Well, what about this? This is a thing that I actually encounter in my channel as well. I do have a small following of Christians who just basically follow me to hate on Islam. And then, as you've experienced, when I've done a few videos on Christianity, they'll say, "Oh, looks like you're still influenced by your Muslim upbringing," or some variation of that. So that's the classic thing you'll see in a lot of religions. Even Muslims will say, "Why are you talking about us? Well, look what Christians have done. Look at the Crusades. Look at the Inquisition," which is a dodge, pretty much.
Yes, yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because, like I said earlier, you don't want to feed those people, but you can't stop them from existing.
I think there's another challenge that is important to mention with all this, and again, unfortunately, it does tie into the whole identity politics world we're living in, where, and I'll say I'm not a fan of this, of where me, as someone from a Palestinian background, well, I have more of a right to say something about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict than you do, for example. That's what some people will say. I don't believe that at all. I might know more, I might have more knowledge or just personal experience than you, but that doesn't mean that your opinion is invalid, that your opinion is hopelessly subjective in the sense of being unacceptable. We all have our subjective perceptions. And so here's the thing that's so challenging about the whole Islamophobia thing is, if we look at the power imbalances, power relationships, dynamics of the past century, a lot of the Muslim countries were essentially oppressed colonies of countries in the West, countries like the UK, France, Germany, many more. And you can see that with the US and its more recent imperialism. So especially when you have people who are from my background, who are immigrants to the UK or Canada or the US or wherever in the West, you're coming in from this position of having been oppressed. You're a newcomer, and I can tell you that this is a real tangible thing where your culture is seen or felt as inferior, whether directly or indirectly. When you see people from your background being portrayed as terrorists, let's say, from my background, or our cuisine being viewed as quaint and exotic. So even something like benign like that can impact you. So just put yourself in the shoes of someone who's an immigrant to this country, who looks different than, let's say, the Brad Pitts or the people you see on TV. Someone who doesn't have that name, Brad, someone who has a really awkward to pronounce name. And these are just two little examples of just how you just feel foreign within this own culture and you want to fit in. And as we tragically see in many instances, I think you can really see it in France, for example, where immigrants just can't be integrated into the local culture for various reasons that I'm not going to get into here. But you get this bitter resentment when someone now is targeting your religion, and you might even want to lean on your religion more because that's part of you that's still authentically from your heritage, when everything else around you, the way you dress, the way you look, even the language you speak. I'm speaking English right now. I'm speaking the language of a country that oppressed my people once upon a time. So you need some sort of outlet, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, that's a religion. And then look, now they're coming and criticizing our religion. So that's, I think, why it pushes Muslims back against the wall a lot. And just to mention a quick example of something that you can kind of take it in both ways, which I think you'll be probably familiar with this example, was the famous case of when Salman Rushdie wrote his most infamous book, The Satanic Verses, I think in the late 80s. And a fatwa was issued against him. And there was uproar throughout the Muslim world about him. I think a few, maybe one or more of the translators of his book were actually murdered.
Yeah,
and he had to go into hiding. And he still, I think till this day, he still has bodyguards. He still has to take all these precautions for his safety. And when you read the book, which I have read, and I love, I think you can maybe see it behind me somewhere. It's, oh yeah, that's it right here. So the book is a very interesting account of what it's like to be an immigrant, whether from a Muslim background or maybe just specifically from the part of Asia where Salman Rushdie is originally from, and being in the UK, what that experience feels like of trying to just kind of wrap these two cultures together. But it's also a satire of Islam that a lot of Muslims found offensive. So the question becomes, here's a good way of putting it, actually. I wrote it down somewhere. So is it racist to say some cultures have better ideas and values than others? Not an easy one.
On just the face of the question, I would say no. But I'm also aware that most of us, probably most people in the world, would be biased and say that my culture, the one that I have, is the one that has the correct values. I'm going to say no, but I am aware that it's a bigger issue.
Exactly, I know. I didn't mean to put you too much on the spot, because I think
being able to ask the question is more valuable probably than anything else.
No, I totally agree. I would say I also agree with you that I don't think it is racist, but this is the challenge that you'll face. Like, let's talk about Salman Rushdie's experience as well. This is someone whose experience in life straddles both worlds. Like, he used to be Muslim, and he actually, I don't think a lot of people know this, but he at one point retracted what his book said and said, "Oh well, I'm a Muslim, or I accept Islam." At some point, yeah, he did, and this was just out of fear. And so it's really scary, because then the question becomes, who is this ultimate arbiter? And you can see it from both sides. Do we, and let's say the West in general, do we just cater to whatever the values are of other cultures because we don't want to seem offensive? So we'll censor books like the Satanic Verses. We won't allow them. Or we'll censor any kind of criticism. Or do we take a stand and then be, perceived as saying, oh, well, our culture is obviously better. Our values are obviously better. And that's the scary thing, because there is, for me, that one I don't have an answer for, because it's almost like this balancing act you have to perform. Because if you really have an objection with the values of a certain religion or culture, I don't think you should stay silent as long as you're focused on the values in of themselves. But then if you say something, even if you're someone like Salman Rushdie, and you get the kind of hate and death threats that he received, what's left? Like, what can you do? I'll tell you what most people do. They just don't want to say anything. They stay silent. They stay quiet. They don't want to rock the boat. And sadly, when you do that, then nothing changes.
I mean, looking at so many countries in the world where, women's rights are barely changing, or changing at an incredibly slow pace. And that conversation outside of those places is so slowed down. And it's difficult because, regarding the, is it racist to think one culture's values is above another? I mean, no, but I think you kind of have a responsibility to think about it in an individual, a more individualistic kind of way, because it doesn't have to be just a sliding scale, right, of this or that. It's not like a seesaw. And you have to go in, I think, acknowledging that racism is a part of the culture that, you know, we're, say, arguing is better. I think the distinction between, say, you know, being racist or whatever versus valid criticism is, I think, if you're genuinely criticizing a belief system or a political system or anything like that, your concern is for the people in that system, because those are the people that are being hurt by it. Whereas something like, you know, the Christian saying, well, why don't you, the Muslims and Islam, that's very much coming from a perspective of, I don't like them, they don't belong in my country or whatever, you know, they're yelling on Facebook today. It's the individual people in the religion that are the ones being hurt. And those are the people, whether I'm talking about Christianity or we're talking about Islam or any other major religion, those are the people that are being hurt.
I think it also comes down to this question of, can we respect something, like respect certain values that conflict with ours, even if we don't tolerate them, and still all live together? And this is where it also kind of becomes a bit problematic, because let's say you have a Muslim neighbor who moves in. There's and let's say you're a family, so you have kids and they have kids around the same age, and their kid is going around in school saying something like, "Oh, homosexuals are abominations. They should go to hell," and they're saying this in school. I think this is the thing that legitimately concerns a lot of people, and they're not bigots, they're not racists. These are the little things that can happen in just your day-to-day life. What do you do as a parent there when your kid comes to you and says, well, this is what I heard in school? Here's the concern. Let's say if you went to the school and said, this is unacceptable that someone could say something so horrifying in school, you should say something, they're going to be afraid to say something, because then they'll be perceived as criticizing and attacking Islam. And what do you tell your child? Do you tell your child to just accept that because it's a very controversial issue and we don't want you to get hurt or get in trouble? That's not very good either. And if you tell them you should take a stand and say something, then you're creating all this tension with your next door neighbor. So I think I don't have a solution for this either, unfortunately. But again, I have to appeal to the things we've been discussing, that it just comes down to our intent and our target. So also just understanding, I understand where these things come from within your religion, but that doesn't mean I accept them. And here is point A, B, C, D, E of why I think it's wrong. So a little thing about me and my experience as well, just in this area. So I used to be homophobic. And it's really hard for me to say this. I feel embarrassed. I guess I was raised into it, so I can't blame myself too much, but still kind of embarrassing. I used to be homophobic. I used to be repulsed if I just saw two men kissing. It made me physically cringe. And something like the sitcom Will and Grace, it was a target of just jokes. If we saw anyone doing something in school that was a little bit, let's say, perceived as being effeminate, then you're being mocked, you're being scorned. If you had long hair, even those little kinds of things. And these things aren't exclusively from Islam, they are cultural as well, I'm not going to deny that. But Islam empowers those things. You get the power to reinforce those things through the religion. And here's the realization I had when I finally left Islam a few years later after those school experiences. I asked myself, why am I repulsed by two men kissing? And beyond that, what is the thing that is actually wrong with homosexuality? And I realized I don't know. It kind of blew my mind. I just realized, well, I've just always been taught that this is wrong, this is repulsive, and it's been reinforced by all the people around me. And that's it. There's no actual point A, B, C, D, E basis for it. I mean, you'll hear some things from people, well, what's the classic thing? It's Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And yeah, and
Yes.
God created us to have children, and a homosexual couple can't have children. They'll throw in things like that, but that's not the actual reason. It's just this culturally, societally taught repulsion. And if I were to be an anthropologist for just like a moment, I would say it's probably rooted in the fact that mortality rates used to be really high, life expectancy was really short, and if we want to go back to the origins of Islam, these little tribes where a lot of unpredictability, a lot of chaos in their day-to-day lives, order, normalcy, and tradition were valued, most likely. And you wanted people to be all doing the same thing, and you probably wanted them to have children. So in that sense, you can see why something like homosexuality would be discouraged. So here's what I would do on this kind of issue if I had this neighbor. I would tell them what I just said. I would tell them my personal experience. I would tell them how I don't really see what the real basis for this is. And I would also share what might be the secular historical reason for why this thing exists. And you can do the same thing with things like why alcohol is prohibited in Islam, or why pork is not considered kosher with Jewish people. And if you try to come at it with this point of understanding and really doing your research, I think this is a really key point as well, especially if you don't belong to this religion. Like, for example, on my channel, I don't talk much about Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, because I don't know much about them. I'll only say what I've actually studied and researched. I think that's a very important point too.
Yeah, I agree. And I think when you're talking about that kind of situation, in a school or whatever with a child, I think it goes back to the intent. It would be wrong to blame, punish the child. The right thing to do, whatever, if we can figure out what the right thing to do would be in that situation. I'm not a parent, which I feel like is probably a big part of what would you do there. But the right thing to do is to critique the idea, the statement, and then go back to the historicity. What are maybe the reasons behind it? Why is it something that you have maybe the right to feel, but it's not appropriate to share with children? People struggle to do that. People struggle to feel safe or comfortable doing that for fear of that criticism being read as something else.
And I understand that fear. And thanks for reminding me to just mention this, because I did say I would bring it up in the very beginning in part 1. Well, the reason I do this channel with a pseudonym, not my actual name, is because, as I alluded to earlier, I work in journalism, in the media, and beyond just the maybe, let's say, paranoid concern about my personal safety, if the wrong person just found out, oh, he's saying these things against Islam, I'm going to just stab him in the street, which I don't think about it a lot, but it is a concern. I'm not going to say it isn't. It's the fear and concern for my career. What if someone found out that I've been saying these things and just emails an editor of mine, and the editor decides, you know what, better not to use this person again. I might not even know about it. I'll just stop hearing from this editor. And all it takes is one person who's really gung-ho, like a very gung-ho Muslim activist who just really wants to make this gesture for whatever purpose, to make themselves feel better, to feel like they've done something to glorify Islam, or maybe they just legitimately think I should be silenced because I'm dangerous. That fear is real, and this is a very low-level fear compared to what other people have to go through. There's ex-Muslims who worry about being disowned from their families, who worry about losing their children if their husband or their spouse found out. There's people who are legitimately worried about getting killed. There's a lot of ex-Muslim activists who get death threats on social media all the time, And I don't want to generalize too much, but it's very clear to me that the female ex-Muslim activists are the ones who get it the worst. Now, why is that? I don't know. I could speculate, but I think it is an interesting phenomenon that the women get it much worse, and it is a scary thing. So that's, I guess, the real point of why I want to do this, and I'm so glad we had this conversation, is we need to put our voices out there. How many people even know that there is something called an ex-Muslim, or that there's these ex-Muslim communities that are just trying to get their voices out, and what the challenges of being an ex-Muslim are? I really don't know. I mean, even before I waded into this world, I didn't know there was a thing called ex-Muslim. When I was Muslim, I couldn't even conceptualize that there were people who had left Islam. It just didn't even come to mind.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. It's kind of scary to think about that, because I'm wondering like how big of an uphill battle this is. But it's one of those things as well where I can't imagine doing anything else despite the risks.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do hope I never end up in a Salman Rushdie situation.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Yeah. Because, well, I guess maybe this is a good place to just kind of end things. I wanted to ask you the question of, let's say, a book by Salman Rushdie, The Satanic Verses, which I recommend, by the way, to anyone watching, and I recommend to you, Emma. Mm-hmm. He's a great writer, aside from that book. So the book was meant as a satire, and while also asking heavy, difficult questions about Islam. My own grandfather, who was a writer and loved literature, considered that book to be filth, propaganda, because it criticized Islam, or it appeared to be making mockery of Islam. So here's my question. What do you think of things like that, of things that come from the West, Western countries, that are satirizing Islam, making jokes about it? And you probably know a few of the famous examples, like the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, or the cartoons, I think, from Denmark or from a Scandinavian country that caused such a huge uproar because they depicted the Prophet Muhammad. Mm-hmm. Do you think those kinds of things are Islamophobic? Or because these aren't really like the target, like you can ask the question, what is the target here? What is the intent?
I don't know if they're Islamophobic. I don't think I know enough to answer that question. I think they should be allowed to exist without frightening consequences, because I think that should be the case for any religion, any belief system of any kind. It's a difficult, it does seem like somewhat of an uphill battle to kind of change the attitudes to talking about Islam and, you know, any kind of controversial religion or community even. The best kind of way, from my sort of outsider perspective, what I'm sort of coming up with as the best kind of action plan to change things is to highlight ex-Muslim voices first, because, as you said, not only, you know, would people like yourself be more knowledgeable, but it's definitely harder for people to, you know, I mean, you do still get the accusations, but it's harder to accuse those people of inviting Islamophobia or something like that. And I think people are more likely to listen and expect that to be genuine, rather than people like me who might have some kind of perceived other intent. I think people like me should be allowed to criticize Islam without worrying about that. But I think because that's not the stage that we're at, it's probably more useful in terms of having people listen. I think it's more useful to uplift ex-Muslim voices who have that experience and can, because from my perspective, a lot of it is what's going to make people more willing to listen. And I think in this situation, they'd be more willing to listen to you than me. So I think it's valuable for me to make your voice louder.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I appreciate
Thank you
that.
for the very difficult questions.
You're welcome. I would want to say I do appreciate that from you, but what I also want to say is I still encourage people like you, especially people who have big audiences, to just share your thoughts and perspectives too, because I think we're just in this day and age where we're so focused on who the person is and what their background is and what they look like before we even listen to what they say. And despite your different background, I'd want to hear the content of your arguments, your ideas, and judge them on that merit, not just on, oh, well, they're from the UK, so, and they're white, so forget about it. Even when it comes to like making a joke or about something as controversial as Islam, you should be free to make that joke. It is a joke after all. Yeah, I mean, that's the scary thing when we can't even just make jokes about something. What does that say about the thing that we're making a joke on? It probably says that we maybe should be making jokes about it, because why does this have this weird power over our lives, aside from all the things that we've discussed about xenophobia and power dynamics and multiculturalism and all that? I think we should be able to make jokes.
I agree. I couldn't agree more.